A queen who was born warrior, born beautiful. Hello, this is History in the Shadow. Please subscribe our channel if you like our videos. She ruled an empire, commanded armies, seduced Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, spoke 9 languages and authored medical texts. Yet history reduced Cleopatra VII to a beautiful seductress who destroyed men with lust. The truth is more complex, more fascinating, and far more dangerous. This is the story of a queen who weaponized everything: her mind, her body, her kingdom, and almost defeated Rome itself. History calls her a temptress, but she was a warrior who fought with every weapon available. Alexandria, Egypt, 48 BC. The greatest library in the ancient world burns. Julius Caesar's fleet has set fire to Egyptian ships in the harbor, and the flames have spread to the docks, to the warehouses, to the repository of human knowledge that took 3 centuries to build. While the city burns inside Cleopatra's palace, history is being made in a different way. Cleopatra VII Philopator, 21 years old, Queen of Egypt, stands before the most powerful man in the world. Julius Caesar, dictator of Rome, conqueror of Gaul, destroyer of armies. She has been smuggled into his presence wrapped in a carpet because her brother, also her husband, thanks to Ptolemaic tradition, controls the city and wants her dead. She has no army, no allies, no leverage except what she was born with: intelligence, beauty, and absolute confidence that she could seduce the most dangerous man alive and use him to reclaim her throne. What happens next will change the course of Western civilization. This is not a story about a woman who used sex to get power. This is a story about a warrior queen who understood that in a world ruled by men, a woman's weapons had to be different, but could be just as deadly. The warrior lineage, born to rule and fight, Cleopatra wasn't born into peace. She was born into a dynasty drowning in blood. The Ptolemies, Greek rulers of Egypt since Alexander the Great's death, maintained power through strategic marriages, frequent murders, and occasional military competence. Cleopatra's family tree was less a tree and more a tangled wreath of incest and assassination. Her father, Ptolemy XII Elites, was a weak king who lost Cyprus to Rome, fled Egypt to escape riots, and regained his throne only through massive bribes to Roman politicians and the military intervention of Roman general Aulus Gabinius. He left Egypt bankrupt and humiliated. When he died in 51 BC, 18-year-old Cleopatra inherited a kingdom drowning in debt, threatened by Rome, and disputed by her 10-year-old brother and husband Ptolemy XIII. Most scholars focus on what happened next: the civil war, Caesar's arrival, the seduction. But they miss what Cleopatra did before Caesar. She raised an army. Historical sources, Plutarch, Cassius Dio, Josephus, mention this almost in passing, but it's crucial. Cleopatra fled Alexandria when her brother's advisors turned the military against her, but she didn't flee Egypt. She went to the border regions, recruited mercenaries, gathered loyal troops, and prepared to march on Alexandria with military force. She was preparing to retake her throne through warfare. The seduction of Caesar was Plan B, a brilliant contingency when she realized Roman legions were already in Alexandria and could be turned to her purpose. This is a woman who understood violence, who commanded armies, who was willing to lead soldiers into battle against her own brother. The traditional narrative, helpless queen seduced by powerful Roman, is nonsense. She was a general who found a more efficient way to deploy force. The intellectual weapon, mind as military advantage, but warfare wasn't Cleopatra's only weapon. Her mind was potentially more dangerous. Plutarch, writing about a century after her death, states that Cleopatra spoke Egyptian, Greek, Ethiopian, Troglodytic, Hebrew, Arabic, Syrian, Median, and Parthian. 9 languages. This wasn't scholarly hobby, it was strategic mastery. Every previous Ptolemaic ruler governed Egypt without speaking Egyptian, communicating with native populations through interpreters. Cleopatra was the first Ptolemaic pharaoh in 300 years to actually speak the language of the kingdom she ruled. This gave her immense advantages. She could speak directly to Egyptian priests, securing religious legitimacy the previous Ptolemies lacked. She could read intelligence reports from across her kingdom without relying on translators who might filter information. She could conduct diplomacy personally, without intermediaries who might have agendas of their own. She also wrote extensively. Ancient sources credit her with treatises on medicine, cosmetics, weights and measures, and alchemy. Most are lost, but medieval alchemists referenced Cleopatra the Alchemist as a foundational figure. Whether this is Cleopatra VII specifically is debated, but the Ptolemaic dynasty was known for scholarly pursuits, and Cleopatra had access to the library of Alexandria's resources. She understood that knowledge was power, literal, practical power. Medical knowledge let her ensure her own health and potentially poison enemies. Cosmetic knowledge created the legendary beauty routines that enhanced her appearance. Understanding weights and measures was crucial for administering Egypt's complex economy. This wasn't a woman who got by on looks. This was a polymath who deployed intellectual weapons as strategically as military ones. The Roman campaign. Seducing empires, now the seductions. Let's be honest about what these were: military alliances negotiated through sexual relationships. When Cleopatra smuggled herself into Caesar's presence in 48 BC, she wasn't just offering sex. She was offering a strategic partnership. Egypt was wealthy. Caesar was drowning in debt from his civil war against Pompey. Cleopatra controlled grain supplies that could feed Rome. Caesar controlled legions that could crush her brother's faction. The sex was real. She bore him a son, Caesarion. But the sex was also strategy. By becoming Caesar's lover, she bound him to her cause emotionally and politically. He couldn't easily abandon her without looking weak, without betraying their child, without losing access to Egyptian wealth. Caesar made her queen, killed her brother-husband in battle, and installed her with a new brother-husband, Ptolemy XIV, age 12, who she almost certainly murdered 3 years later, as co-ruler. Then he stayed in Alexandria for months, neglecting Roman politics, reportedly besotted with the Egyptian queen. But was he besotted, or was she just that strategic? Contemporary sources describe Cleopatra as not conventionally beautiful. Plutarch says her beauty was not in itself incomparable, but rather her intelligence, charm, and voice made her irresistible. Translation: she was extraordinarily skilled at psychological manipulation. When Caesar was assassinated in 44 BC, Cleopatra immediately pivoted. She returned to Egypt, murdered her brother-husband, and made Caesarion co-ruler. Then she waited to see which Roman strongman would emerge from the chaos. Mark Antony won, so Cleopatra seduced him too. The Antony affair. Luxury as weapon. The relationship between Cleopatra and Mark Antony was different. Deeper, more complex, ultimately more destructive. Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BC to account for her actions during the Roman Civil War. She'd nominally supported Caesar's assassins, though she'd actually sent help to neither side. Excellent strategic hedging. Cleopatra arrived in a display designed to overwhelm. Plutarch describes a ship with purple sails, silver oars, musicians playing flutes and harps, and Cleopatra herself dressed as Venus, lying under a gold-embroidered canopy, while servants dressed as Cupids fanned her. The entire production was calculated theater, presenting herself not as a supplicant but as a goddess. It worked. Antony was a soldier, a drinker, a man of appetites. Cleopatra offered to satisfy all of them. She brought him to Alexandria and submerged him in luxury so complete it became disorienting. Ancient sources describe dinners costing 10,000 sesterces, enough to feed a Roman legion for months. Drinking contests, elaborate costume parties where they disguise themselves and wander Alexandria's streets. Gambling for enormous stakes. But underneath the luxury was strategy. While Antony feasted, Cleopatra was conducting diplomacy, administering her kingdom, planning for the future. She bore him 3 children, twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, and later Ptolemy Philadelphus, binding him to her dynasty. And crucially, she convinced him that Egypt and Rome should merge, that their children should inherit both empires, that East and West could unite under their combined rule. This was staggeringly ambitious. Cleopatra was proposing to become not just Queen of Egypt, but co-empress of the entire Mediterranean world. She was leveraging her relationship with Antony to attempt the greatest power grab in ancient history. The military queen. Command and combat. Here's what history forgets. Cleopatra commanded armies and navies in actual combat. When Antony launched his disastrous Parthian campaign in 36 BC, Cleopatra provided significant military support, ships, supplies, money. When he returned defeated, she met him with reinforcements and helped extract his remaining forces. At the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, the naval engagement that determined whether Octavian or Antony would rule Rome, Cleopatra personally commanded her fleet. 60 Egyptian ships, positioned as a reserve squadron, under her direct command. Traditional narratives claim she fled mid-battle, causing Antony's defeat. But recent historical analysis suggests something more complex. The battle was already lost, and Cleopatra made the calculated decision to preserve her fleet for continued resistance rather than waste ships in a doomed engagement. Antony followed her because together they might rebuild and continue the war. It didn't work. Octavian pursued them to Alexandria. Antony committed suicide, and Cleopatra faced the final choice: surrender to Octavian and be paraded through Rome in chains as a captive queen, or die on her own terms. She chose death, but even her suicide was strategic. The final seduction. Death as victory. August 12, 30 BC. Cleopatra locked in her mausoleum, Octavian's forces surrounding Alexandria. She knows she's lost, but she has one final move. She attempts to seduce Octavian. Yes, seriously. At 39, having just lost her kingdom and lover, she tries to seduce the man who's destroyed her. Because if she can make him personally invested in her, she might survive, might preserve something for her children, might turn complete defeat into partial victory. It doesn't work. Octavian is cold, calculating, immune to whatever charms had enslaved Caesar and Antony. He makes it clear she'll be taken to Rome as a prisoner, displayed in his triumph, then likely executed or imprisoned permanently. So Cleopatra stages her death with the same theatrical genius she applied to everything else. The exact method is debated: venomous snake, the traditional story; poisoned comb, poison taken orally. But the effect was what mattered. She dressed in full royal regalia, lay on a golden couch, and died looking like a goddess. The message was clear. Rome might conquer Egypt, but Rome would never break Egypt's queen. She would die sovereign, regal, in control. Octavian could parade her corpse, but he couldn't parade a broken, humiliated captive queen begging for mercy. Even in death, Cleopatra controlled the narrative. The affairs, strategy. Not scandal now. Let's address the born for affairs with many men aspect honestly. Cleopatra had exactly two famous affairs, Caesar and Antony. That's it. For a woman ruling for 21 years, maintaining international diplomacy across the Mediterranean, that's remarkably restrained. But Roman propaganda, primarily Octavian's after he defeated her, portrayed her as a seductress who destroyed strong men through sexual manipulation. This served Octavian's purposes. It explained why two great Roman leaders, Caesar and Antony, abandoned duty for an Eastern queen, while conveniently ignoring that both men made rational strategic choices to ally with Egypt's wealth and power. The propaganda was so effective it survived 2 millennia. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra presents her as destructively sexual. Hollywood consistently portrays her as defined by seduction. Modern references assume she was promiscuous. The evidence suggests otherwise. She was calculatingly monogamous, fully committed to each relationship while it served strategic purposes, then ruthlessly moving on when circumstances changed. This wasn't unusual for royalty. Political marriages, strategic alliances sealed with sex, children as diplomatic bonds. This was standard practice for male rulers, but when a female ruler did it, suddenly it became scandalous. Cleopatra was playing the same game as every king, emperor, and pharaoh in history. She just played it better. The beauty question. Weaponized appearance. Was Cleopatra beautiful? Honestly, we don't know. Surviving coins show a woman with a prominent nose, strong chin, and severe features, not conventionally attractive by ancient Greek standards, which preferred delicate features. But coins were propaganda, not portraits. They emphasized strength and authority over beauty. What we know from literary sources is that Cleopatra was extraordinarily skilled at presentation. She understood costume, makeup, lighting, setting, all the theatrical tools that create impression. When meeting Caesar, she probably spent hours preparing, selecting perfumes and cosmetics that would appeal to Roman tastes, choosing clothing that suggested wealth and exoticism without being barbaric. When meeting Antony, she arrived as Venus, mythology made flesh through costume and stagecraft. She wrote treatises on cosmetics, used the resources of Egypt, the ancient world's cosmetics capital, to create appearance-enhancing routines, employed perfumes that ancient sources suggest contained mind-altering substances. In modern terms, she had an extraordinary grasp of personal branding. She created an image, beautiful, exotic, dangerously alluring Eastern queen, and she performed it so convincingly that it became reality in the minds of those who encountered her. The warrior assessment. Her real power, so was Cleopatra a warrior? Absolutely, just not in the conventional sense. She fought with economics, using Egypt's grain supplies as leverage, controlling trade routes, manipulating currency and debt to create political advantages. She fought with diplomacy, speaking directly to constituencies in their own languages, conducting negotiations without intermediaries, building alliances through personal relationships. She fought with psychology, understanding what motivated Caesar: glory, wealth, legacy. What motivated Antony: pleasure, validation, grandeur, and deploying precisely calculated approaches to each. She fought with propaganda, presenting herself as both Greek heir to Ptolemaic tradition and Egyptian pharaoh descended from gods, Isis incarnate for Egyptian audiences and Hellenistic monarch for Greeks. She fought with her body, yes, through sex, but also through childbearing, each child a political bond. Through appearance, carefully managed to create specific impressions. Through presence, sources consistently describe her as commanding, dominant, impossible to ignore. And when necessary, she fought with actual military forces, commanding navies, funding armies, leading strategic retreats. The fact that history reduced this extraordinarily complex figure to beautiful seductress says more about historical prejudice than about Cleopatra herself. The counterfactual: what if she'd won? Imagine Actium ends differently. Cleopatra and Antony defeat Octavian. C. Continuous RIPT 4 continued. A queen who was born warrior, born beautiful, born for affairs with many mont counterfactual. What if she'd won? Imagine Actium ends differently. Cleopatra and Antony defeat Octavian. The Roman Republic doesn't become the Roman Empire under Augustus. Instead, it becomes a dual monarchy, East and West united under Antony and Cleopatra's combined rule. What would that world look like? First, the center of power shifts. Instead of Rome dominating the Mediterranean, Alexandria becomes co-capital. Greek culture, already influential, becomes politically dominant. Egyptian religion, administration, and economic systems merge with Roman military might. Second, their children inherit. Caesar Ion, Julius Caesar's son, would have a legitimate claim to supreme power, backed by both Egyptian wealth and Roman military support. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the twins by Antony, were already designated as rulers of eastern territories. This creates a Hellenistic superdynasty spanning 3 continents. Third, women's power becomes normalized at the highest level. If Cleopatra rules as co-empress, if her daughter Cleopatra Selene inherits significant territories, which historically she did, becoming queen of Mauritania, suddenly female rulership isn't aberrant, it's established precedent. Fourth, the cultural legacy changes dramatically. Instead of Western civilization being defined by Roman military culture overlaid with Christianity, it's defined by Greco-Egyptian syncretic culture, possibly remaining pagan longer, possibly absorbing Christianity differently. This isn't fantasy. This nearly happened. Actium was a close battle. Different weather, different tactics, different luck, and history transforms completely. Cleopatra came within one naval battle of reshaping Western civilization. She lost, but the fact that she came so close reveals just how formidable she was. The Roman propaganda machine. Destroying her legacy. Octavian won Actium. Then he won the propaganda war. He couldn't admit that he defeated a brilliant, dangerous political and military rival. That would make her seem too powerful, too legitimate. So he reduced her to a sexual predator who'd corrupted strong Roman men through Eastern decadence. His propaganda portrayed Cleopatra as a seductress who destroyed men's reason through lust, a foreign barbarian threatening Roman values, a witch who used magic and potions to control men, a coward who fled battle, abandoning Antony, a tyrant ruling over enslaved Egyptians, a threat to Roman masculinity and civic virtue. None of this was true, but it was effective. Octavian, now Augustus, first Roman emperor, commissioned poets, historians, and artists to spread this narrative. Virgil's Aeneid, Horace's Odes, Propertius's Elegies all contain anti-Cleopatra passages presenting her as monstrous, foreign, dangerous, sexual. The propaganda was so effective that it survived 2 millennia. Medieval Christians added layers. She became associated with temptation and sin, the dangerous Eastern woman leading righteous men astray. Renaissance and Enlightenment sources continued the pattern, fascinated by her, but always framing her through sexuality and exoticism. Even modern depictions rarely escape it. Elizabeth Taylor's Cleopatra is defined by beauty and romance. Angelina Jolie's rumored portrayal emphasizes seduction. Popular imagination can't conceive of Cleopatra except through the lens of sexuality. The real Cleopatra, polyglot scholar, strategic genius, military commander, economic administrator, religious leader, mother and warrior queen, has been buried under 2,000 years of propaganda. The Affairs Reconsidered. Sex as Statecraft. Let's examine the affairs with many men claim more carefully. Historical sources document exactly 2 significant relationships. Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. Both were enormously powerful Romans. Both were strategic allies. Both fathered children with her, creating dynastic bonds. But were there others? Rumors suggest possible earlier relationships, perhaps with Roman general Aulus Gabinius, who restored her father to power, though she would have been a teenager and evidence is thin. Some sources suggest possible liaison with Pompey before Caesar, though again, evidence is minimal. What's notable is what didn't happen. Cleopatra didn't have serial affairs with powerful men. She didn't maintain a harem. She didn't use sex indiscriminately as political tool. Instead, she formed 2 major partnerships, both with Rome's most powerful individuals, both resulting in children, both lasting years. This suggests calculated strategy, not promiscuity. Compare this to male rulers of her era. Julius Caesar was famous for affairs with numerous women and men. Augustus, Octavian, forced other men to divorce their wives so he could marry them. Mark Antony had multiple wives and countless affairs. Roman senators routinely kept multiple concubines. But they're not remembered as sexual beings. They're remembered as political and military leaders. Cleopatra did exactly what male rulers did, form strategic sexual partnerships, but she's remembered exclusively for the sex while they're remembered for the strategy. This double standard reveals more about historical sexism than about Cleopatra's actual behavior. The Beauty Reconsidered. Power creates attraction. Modern psychology understands something ancient sources intuited. Power is attractive. When Plutarch says Cleopatra's beauty was not incomparable but her personality was irresistible, he's describing charisma, the quality that makes people want to follow you, please you, be near you. Cleopatra had immense power. She controlled Egypt's wealth, commanded armies and navies, spoke 9 languages, wrote scholarly treatises, could discuss philosophy with intellectuals and military strategy with generals, projected absolute confidence in her own authority. This made her attractive. Not her nose or her figure or her skin, her power. Modern studies consistently show that people perceive powerful individuals as more physically attractive than they actually are. Cleopatra likely benefited from this halo effect. She was probably reasonably attractive, then multiplied that through power, presentation, charisma, and strategic deployment of sexuality. The men she seduced, Caesar and Antony, weren't stupid. They weren't helpless victims of sexual sorcery. They were hard, practical politicians who saw strategic advantage in alliance with Egypt and found that alliance more palatable because it came packaged with an intelligent, interesting, powerful woman. The sexual attraction was real, but it was built on foundations of power, not just physical appearance. The mother and queen. Balancing dual roles. One often ignored aspect of Cleopatra's story. She ruled Egypt while bearing and raising 4 children. Caesarion, 47 BC, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, 40 BC, Ptolemy Philadelphus, 36 BC. For pregnancies while conducting diplomacy, commanding military forces, administering a complex kingdom, and maintaining international relationships. Ancient sources barely mention this. Pregnancy and childbirth were considered private, feminine matters not worth recording in political histories. But the logistics are staggering. She bore Caesar's son while consolidating power against rival factions in Egypt. She was pregnant with Antony's twins while managing Egypt's economy and military support for Roman civil wars. She had her third son by Antony while her kingdom was on war footing against Octavian. Each time, she had to disappear from public life for months, maintain power remotely, then return to active rule while recovering from childbirth. And she used the children strategically. Caesarion was made co-ruler, legitimizing her reign and creating a direct heir to both Egyptian and, theoretically, Roman power. The children with Antony were designated rulers of eastern territories: Armenia, Media, Parthia, Phoenicia, creating a future empire for her dynasty. She was simultaneously mother and monarch, using both roles to strengthen her position. The fact that she managed this while fighting wars and conducting complex diplomacy is remarkable. That the religious queen, Isis incarnate, one crucial aspect that gets lost in Western histories. Cleopatra was a religious leader. As pharaoh, she was considered a living god, specifically the incarnation of Isis, the most powerful goddess in the Egyptian pantheon. This wasn't metaphorical. In Egyptian religious understanding, the pharaoh literally embodied divine power. Cleopatra embraced this completely. She performed ancient rituals at temples throughout Egypt, commissioned elaborate religious art showing her as Isis, spoke to priests in Egyptian, reinforcing her connection to native religious traditions. This gave her enormous power among Egyptian populations. Previous Ptolemaic rulers were seen as foreign Greek overlords. Cleopatra was seen as legitimate pharaoh, blessed by the gods, maintaining cosmic order. When she appeared before Caesar and Antony, she wasn't just a queen, she was a goddess. This added a psychological dimension to the seductions. She wasn't offering just political alliance or sexual pleasure. She was offering connection to divine power, to ancient mysteries, to something the rational Romans couldn't quite understand but found overwhelmingly compelling. The Isis cult was spreading through the Roman world during this period. Cleopatra positioned herself at its center. When she bore Caesar's son, she was the goddess bearing the child of Rome's most powerful man. A mythological narrative in real time, the final battle. Psychological warfare. The Battle of Actium is usually presented as straightforward military engagement, but the psychological warfare beforehand was equally important. Octavian spent months before the battle conducting propaganda campaigns portraying Antony as bewitched by Cleopatra, no longer truly Roman, corrupted by Eastern decadence. He released forged documents supposedly showing Antony planned to move the capital to Alexandria, give Roman territories to Cleopatra's children, and transform Rome into a Hellenistic monarchy. This wasn't about military tactics. This was about morale, legitimacy, and public support. Cleopatra countered by appearing publicly as Isis, emphasizing her divine authority, presenting the conflict as East versus West, ancient mystical power against Roman military brutality. She commissioned artwork showing herself and Antony as gods, suggesting their victory was cosmically ordained. When the actual battle occurred, both sides were already exhausted from months of psychological warfare. Morale was shaky on both sides. Desertions were common. The battle itself was almost anticlimactic, a confused naval engagement where nobody quite won decisively, but Octavian held the field afterward and claimed victory. Cleopatra's retreat with her squadron wasn't cowardice. It was acceptance that the psychological war was lost. Even if they won the naval battle, Octavian had won the propaganda war. Rome would never accept Antony married to an Eastern queen. Continued resistance was futile. The suicide. Ultimate control. Cleopatra's suicide is often presented romantically, dying for love, unable to face life without Antony. But examine it more carefully. She lived at least 10 days after Antony's death. During that time, she negotiated with Octavian, tried to seduce him, strategically, not romantically, attempted to preserve her children's positions, and only chose death when it became absolutely clear that Octavian would parade her through Rome in chains. Her suicide was a final act of control. Octavian wanted to display her as a defeated barbarian queen, proof of Roman supremacy, warning to others who might challenge Rome. Her death in regal dignity denied him that victory. She dressed as Pharaoh, positioned herself on a golden couch, arranged her appearance meticulously, died looking like a goddess in state, not a defeated prisoner. The method, possibly an ASP, Egyptian cobra, a symbol of divine royalty, was symbolically perfect. If the traditional story is true, she was literally killed by a symbol of her own divine power, transforming execution into voluntary apotheosis. She couldn't save her kingdom, but she could control her final image. And that image, dignified, beautiful, divine, undefeated in spirit even in death, is the one that survived. Octavian displayed her corpse in his triumph, but it didn't have the effect he wanted. Instead of seeing a defeated barbarian, Rome saw a queen who'd chosen death over subjugation. In trying to humiliate her, Octavian accidentally cemented her legend, the legacy. What survived Cleopatra's Egypt didn't survive. It became a Roman province. Her dynasty didn't survive. Caesarion was murdered. The other children disappeared into Roman aristocracy. Her political vision didn't survive. No East-West empire, no Hellenistic Renaissance, no female co-ruler of the Mediterranean world. But her legend survived. And legends shape history almost as much as actual events. For 2,000 years, Cleopatra has represented female power, beauty as weapon, the dangerous seductress, the Eastern temptress, the woman who nearly conquered Rome through the bedroom. Every portrayal, Shakespeare, Shaw, Hollywood, grapples with this legend. But recently, scholars are recovering the real Cleopatra, the polyglot administrator, the military commander, the religious leader, the strategic genius who came closer than anyone else to defeating Rome from outside. Genetic studies of her children's descendants, archaeological work in Alexandria, re-examination of ancient sources with less Romanocentric bias, all revealing a more complex figure than history remembered. She was born into privilege but fought constantly to maintain it. She was beautiful, possibly, but weaponized beauty through intelligence and presentation. She had affairs, yes, but strategically deployed sexuality in service of political goals. She was a warrior who understood that war has many battlefields: military, economic, psychological, sexual. Conclusion. The warrior queen. So was Cleopatra born warrior, born beautiful, born for affairs with many men? Born warrior. Absolutely. She commanded armies, led fleets into battle, fought civil wars, and waged psychological warfare against the world's greatest military power. She lost ultimately, but she fought brilliantly. Born beautiful, unclear, and ultimately irrelevant. She understood how to deploy beauty as weapon, which is more important than actually being beautiful. She controlled her image meticulously, creating perceptions that served her strategic goals. Born for affairs with many men. No, this is Roman propaganda. She had two major relationships, both strategic, both resulting in children who strengthened her dynasty. Compared to male rulers of her era, her sexual behavior was remarkably restrained. The real Cleopatra was a complex, brilliant woman operating in a world that gave her few options for wielding power. She deployed every weapon available: wealth, beauty, intelligence, sexuality, military force, religious authority, diplomatic skill, in service of maintaining her kingdom's independence and her dynasty's survival. She nearly succeeded. In a different world, with slightly different luck at Actium, she might have reshaped Western civilization. We might live in a world where female rulers were normalized earlier, where Egyptian and Greek culture dominated instead of Roman, where the Mediterranean remained politically unified under a Hellenistic dynasty she lost. But the fact that she came so close against overwhelming odds, using weapons that male rulers disdained or didn't understand, reveals just how formidable she was. History reduced her to a seductress because that was easier than acknowledging a woman who nearly defeated Rome itself. But we can do better. We can remember Cleopatra as what she actually was. A warrior queen who understood that power takes many forms, and the most dangerous warriors are those who can fight on every battlefield simultaneously. She was born into royalty, yes, But she made herself into legend through intelligence, courage, strategic brilliance, and absolute refusal to accept defeat until death itself removed all other options. That's not a woman born for affairs. That's a warrior who fought until the very end, with every weapon available, against the greatest empire in the ancient world. And she lost. But she lost magnificently. Alexandria Harbor, 30 BC. The lighthouse still burns, guiding ships to a city that's already lost. In her mausoleum, Cleopatra VII, last pharaoh of Egypt, mother of four, seducer of Rome's greatest men, commander of armies, speaker of 9 languages, incarnation of Isis, takes her final breath. Egypt dies with her. But the legend of a queen who almost conquered the world through brilliance, beauty, and absolute refusal to accept limitation. That legend lives forever. And perhaps that's the greatest victory of all. Not surviving, but becoming immortal. The end. Subscribe our channel, please.